Well, listen, I appreciate you who've gotten here so promptly. We're getting a very early start today. I'm very unaccustomed to having this wealth of extra time. And it's a short lesson. We'll be out of here by, no, it's not really. I'm going to drone on. That's really, yeah, that's right, maybe by 3. So anyway, today we are considering Elizabeth of Hungary, who is probably not a household name. You may be familiar with her. She is born about 100 years after Hildegard of Bingen that we looked at last time, which puts her right in the middle of the Crusades. And it's a very tumultuous time for a lot of reasons. This was a transition. Right in the middle of the Crusades, we're sort of transitioning out of feudalism and into what became more modern Europe, and it's the rise of what are called medieval towns. And if you're like me, I think of Robin Hood and jugglers and carnivals and fun times. You know, the image of a medieval town, it wasn't that. It was dirty, it was disease-ridden. They did have these kind of parties occasionally, but for the most part, it was kind of a sad situation because a lot of these people coming out of feudalism, which was sort of dismantling by then, largely the effect of the Crusades, didn't have anywhere to go, and so they became kind of just the very poor class in these towns. And that's really what is probably most memorable about Our Lady today, Elizabeth of Hungary, because she was one of several who took quite a focused interest in their welfare. And that was not true of many in the church. To their shame, kind of ignored them, you know. But she was one who really did take it upon herself to try to reach out. So that's our main interest in her, and she's an interesting character, interesting story. She was sainted by the Catholic Church shortly after her death, and I think there's good reason for that. We don't do that as Protestants, but we can appreciate what motivated them. So anyway, this is Our Lady of the Day. The text that I'm choosing to kind of capture her story, I think she would be too modest to allow this verse to be applied, but I'm going to do it anyway because she's not here to defend herself. But this is exactly the way she lived and the quality of life that she exhibited. When Paul wrote to the Philippians, chapter 2, verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition, which is worth the price of admission all by itself, you know. Do nothing. How much of my life have I done things out of selfish ambition? I am embarrassed to think about it. But this is Paul's counsel to all of us. By the way, my wife wants me to close these. I can read her mind. 42 years of marriage, and I just get it. So, honey, loud and clear, I heard you. You know, you don't notice it, but on the video later, it's just kind of ugly over there, and so that's part of the reason. Anyway, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. And I do think that that is probably the best way to capture the character of this remarkable woman, Elizabeth of Hungary. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at her life. Our Father, we are deeply grateful that you have peppered the history of your people with these astonishing, extraordinary stories, which simply serve once again to confirm the great truth of the gospel, that you lift us out of the natural state of misery in which we're born to things far beyond what we could have hoped to do by your Spirit. We're grateful for examples of that, including Elizabeth, and we pray that we'd be fair to the details of her story as we think about it this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, the times, I mentioned a little bit of it just to get it in our minds. The Crusades are winding down. Hildegard, we looked at last time, was right at the first crusade. She was born as it started. Now we're 100 years later, and so we're about halfway through. And this is a time of remarkable transition. The Crusades themselves, of course, get very mixed reviews, but the impact in European life was staggering. And we're kind of halfway through that impact. You know, the Renaissance is out there, just the first little inklings of it are beginning to show up, not really taking much traction yet, but nevertheless it's on the horizon. As I say, these medieval towns are beginning to arise. The people earlier had lived in a feudal kind of situation, the serfs, you know, for the most part out there working, getting along in that kind of relatively impoverished existence, but it was a way to make it through life. And now those things are kind of losing their status in the society, and we haven't quite seen where it's going, and so these towns are popping up. But they were pretty brutal. If you could go back in a time machine and walk down the street of one of those towns, you'd be pretty horrified, I think you would, you know, at what we saw. At some of the disease conditions and so on, the rats running around. I mean, it was just kind of an ugly situation. So that's what's going on. And the story we have here is connected to at least one of those medieval towns and the rulership in it. Anyway, the church, for its part, for the most part, is becoming more wealthy. It's an odd irony that many people are living in grinding poverty, but the church is becoming increasingly wealthy, largely courtesy of the Crusades. The Crusades get mixed reviews, but it was good for business. And so the church is getting increasing wealth, and with that comes increasing political power. But some spirits running around were realizing that that was causing the church to lose focus on its primary mission, you know, which is to reach out to people individually, reach them with the gospel, and that sort of thing. So there were these wonderful spirits of town, I mean, I've used that metaphorically, these wonderful people running around who were trying to recapture the simplicity of the gospel and especially communicate it to those who most desperately needed it. And these are names you recognize. We looked at Hildegard last time. Francis of Assisi is a good example. Bernard of Clairvaux. There were others that were working to translate the Bible. It was actually illegal to translate the Bible into the vernacular. You had to read it in Latin or not at all. And so there were those who were trying to sort of refit the character of the church to meet the needs of the time. But for the most part, it was a lonely quest that they were involved in. Elizabeth was born into a Christian royal family, the Arpad family. It was in Hungary, so she's known as Elizabeth of Hungary, but she spent very little of her time in Hungary. Her father and her grandfather really did affect her at this point of recognizing the desperate circumstances of the poor. They themselves, though they were modest royalty, I would say. They weren't fabulously wealthy. But nevertheless, they took a deep interest and did what they could to try to reach those within their own domains who might be in need. And so that sort of was carved into her DNA pretty early. Her father's name was Andras. He became the ruler of that area there in Hungary. It was kind of a province in Hungary in the year 1205. So just get your bearings. Remember, Hildegard was born about 1100, so now we're 1205, just about 100 years later. He married Gertrude. They gave birth to their firstborn, Elizabeth, in 1207. All right, 1207 is a big year for various reasons, one of which is that Francis of Assisi had a vision that year. He had just returned from being a prisoner of war in an ill-conceived battle that took place with a neighboring province, finally was released, came back, and really had a whole new view of life. It was kind of a transforming year he spent as a prisoner of war. And in the context of kind of regrouping himself, this is 1207 now, he had a vision, and the vision said to him, "Rebuild my church." Now, he didn't quite know what it meant, but he did know that outside of Assisi, there was a little chapel that lay in ruins. It had been abandoned years earlier, and he thought what it meant was go rebuild that chapel. Now, his dad was a wealthy cloth merchant, so he thought, well, the best way to do that is to swipe some cloth from my dad and sell it and use the money to rebuild the chapel. Now we, of course, would think, no, Francis, let's rethink your strategy here. But, you know, he was young and enthusiastic and kind of had this. So that's what he did. His dad sued him and, won the suit. And Francis, in a kind of huff, said, okay, for you, I'm out of here. He said it in more polite words, but he left. And that was the beginning of the Franciscan movement, you see. And so his whole vision was that these monks should quit going into the monasteries and they should go out into the streets. So they were called friars. And the Franciscan movement was conspicuous because for the first time the monks were out among the people. Now I mention all of that to say the Franciscans had a huge effect on Elizabeth. It was still a young movement. You know, when she was born, Francis was just getting started. But they do have quite an important relationship with each other as the story goes on. So bear that in mind as we continue. All right. Early childhood, she lived in a castle, modest castle in Hungary, grew up speaking both Hungarian and German. Even at a young age, both languages were common. In 1211, she became betrothed to Ludwig IV of Thuringia. Now, you who are good at arithmetic are thinking, that's when she's 4 years old. And you're right, you know. And so you might think that's a little young to be, pawned off as a bride to somebody, but that's the way they did it back then. I'm not going to defend it. I'm just reporting what happened. So anyway, 4 years old. Ludwig is 11. So here we have a 4-year-old and 11-year-old. He's going to be the future Duke of Thuringia. Now, Thuringia would be in modern-day Germany. At the time, it was under the Holy Roman Empire. So it's that particular vicinity. And if you know your map, Hungary is not that far away. So that's where they are. So at 4 years old, she's actually sent to Wartburg Castle in Thuringia to meet her future husband and to live there in a castle with her 11-year-old future husband. And so that was the arrangement. She came with quite a substantial dowry. And so that was kind of put on ice. That's kind of the wealth that comes with the bride, you know. And so it was not accessible to her, but it was kind of held there in suspension. And there she is. As they grew up, they liked each other. Now, there were a lot of kids in the castle. So it wasn't like just the two of them. But he liked her and she liked him. They called each other brother and sister. You know, that was kind of the way it was. There were other kids. They played around. They had fun. And so that was kind of her early life at Wartburg Castle. By the way, for you church history buffs, Wartburg Castle makes another appearance later in church history. I'm tempted to ask, give you a little quiz. Does anybody know? I would be amazed. Even Phil isn't biting on it. Okay. He's usually the answer man, but it makes a further appearance in the life of Martin Luther after the Diet of Worms, when there was a price on his head. You know, if he were apprehended by the religious authorities, he would have been burned at the stake. And some friends of his kidnapped him and spirited him away to Wartburg Castle. And he lived there for a year. And some people think the most important work he did was at Wartburg when he translated the Bible into vernacular German. There were earlier German translations, but this was kind of like the living Bible. You know, I mean, this was really for the people. So anyway, Wartburg Castle, little church history trivia for you there. Anyway, that's where they were. So Wartburg, it's in Germany. It was a castle, moat, all of that stuff. The kids played typical childhood games. Remember, she's only 4, 5, 6 years old, so they hide and seek. Wouldn't it be fun to play hide and seek in a castle? I mean, you can't beat that. Anyway, she was drawn, even the best records indicate, even as a child, she seemed to have a fascination with worship and the places of worship. And this castle had a chapel, and in the chapel, it was kind of quiet. It was off, you know, kind of in a quiet part of the place. There were candles that were always burning. It was just sort of a place of worship, a kind of place of sensing the other. So even as a child, she seemed to have that psychology that was drawn to places of worship. She seems to have had sincere faith even from a very early age. She was very aware of the poor. Of course, her father had impressed that on her, so we're not too surprised. But the community of Wartburg, one of these medieval towns, if you ever went through there, she was aware of just these people who were just living this really horrific kind of life of near starvation, disease processes, and not much being done for them. It was hard to do anything for them. I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think I did, but I should have. One of the reasons Elizabeth is remembered to this day is because she is considered, maybe, I've heard people argue this who would know such things, that she was probably the inventor of what we consider to be the modern hospital. Now, it's not a modern hospital by modern standards, you understand, but the idea of a clinic available to the people, among the people. Before then, you kind of had to go to the monastery or go to some special place for healing arts. And she thought, no, let's put it right there where the people are. And so that was really her brainchild, but it spread widely and rapidly. And so there's some good argument that that was kind of her invention, but it certainly took off. And by the time we get to the Renaissance, it's quite common. So this is something that's brewing in her, and especially as she was aware of what was going on in that little town, it may have been even as a child she started thinking in those terms. She was very well educated. She read Latin easily, studied the Bible. She knew court manners, etiquette, so on. She was royalty. That was the family experience she had. Ludwig was a future knight. He would be the ruler, but his educational track was different, so they didn't take the same classes together. He was trained in arts of warfare and armaments and that kind of thing. But anyway, they were both children at that point, growing and learning what they needed to know. A series of rather catastrophic tragedies happened that affected both of their lives while they were still children. Elizabeth learned that in 1213, remember, she's born in 1207, so this is when she's 6 years old. She learns that her mother has been killed in an attack from a neighboring chieftain who came in, kind of a sudden surprise attack, wanting to take over. This is the kind of thing that was still happening. The mother was killed. The dad was swept out of town, basically went into exile for the rest of his life. And her entire status as royalty from Hungary evaporated. So Elizabeth had been, of course, connected to that family. The marriage that was proposed was going to be a political alliance between these two, Thuringia on the one hand and this Hungarian province on the other. That goes up in smoke. And a new regime is there. Her parents are out of power. Their wealth is gone. The only thing left of that wealth is the dowry that Elizabeth brought with her when she went to Wartburg. But aside from that, her status has been completely depleted. And Ludwig, now in his mid-teenage years, is facing tremendous pressure from those who surround him, part of the royalty there in that region, saying, you need to politely dismiss this girl. She's not good for business anymore, pal. You need a new marriage relationship with somebody else that can benefit you later, and this ain't it. Now he's mid-teens, and what is she? She's only, he's not even mid-teens. He's probably 14 years old. She's 6. He says no. Really to his credit, because maybe, for whatever reasons, he seems to have really liked her. I think that's really the bottom line. Every evidence is that he really did love her, even as a child. And that certainly carried through into their married life. And so he said no, and his opinion ruled. His parents backed him up and said, if that's what you want, that's it. And so Elizabeth ceases to be a real valuable asset from a political point of view, but from a loving point of view, I think he felt that that was certainly the right decision. But to make matters worse, in 1216, his younger brother and then his father in 1217 were both touched by the plague and died. And so not only tragedy hit the family of Elizabeth, but tragedy hits the family of Ludwig. He's still only a teenager. He would now become the ruler, but to be the ruler, he still had to be knighted. And so he goes through kind of advanced training. He's knighted the following year in 1218, and he became the ruler then in Thuringia. And so essentially from that point on, he's the one who's the dominant authority in that region. Ludwig, the best evidence was a good-looking guy, medium height, very athletic, handsome, well-mannered, and courteous. That is the testimony of multiple sources that have come down to biographers of this. So I think we have it on good authority. He was a good guy. Ludwig was a good guy, even as a teenager. I say even as a teenager because I've had 4 of them, and so I know all about teenagers. Mine were all good too, but they were rare. But anyway, he kind of stood out. He was known for his bravery and in the training he went through, for his facility with arms. But my favorite story about him comes from a biographer of Elizabeth named Laurie Piper. And if you ever want to know more about her life, this is easy to get. You can hunt this down on Amazon. You'll have it by the end of the week or much earlier probably. Anyway, it was common for teenage individuals with special privileges, that would certainly apply to Ludwig, to make use of peasant girls for unseemly activities. Try to keep this polite, this is Sunday school, but anyway, this is the quote that comes from Laurie. It was common to bring peasant girls to the ruler for sexual fun. But once, when a young prince, now this would be a cousin of Ludwig, who's trying to ingratiate himself to Ludwig, you see. So once when a young prince brought such a peasant to Ludwig, and Elizabeth saw her, Ludwig gave the girl 3 silver coins, told his prince friend that if anything happened to her as she was escorted back to her home, the prince would be hanged. So that was what Ludwig thought of that whole arrangement. And it says good things about him. It certainly says that he was a little bit unusual given the general climate of the day. And so anyway, just that little anecdote comes down, something of his character. Elizabeth, she, especially having lost her status there in Hungary, was fairly, she was a modest young lady anyway. There's really no evidence of pretense or kind of this sense of being royalty. That doesn't seem to have been much in her personality. She was uncomfortable wearing the really nice clothing of, the life in the court, that kind of thing. She was criticized for that. Many people thought she should kind of, strut her stuff a little bit, but she was very much uneasy with that. And she seems to have had a deep, humble faith. It does seem very sincere. The records that are available seem to bear this out. She's quoted in one prayer, "In the presence of God and of my King Jesus Christ, how can I, a vile and despicable creature, appear before him crowned with the insignia of royal dignity?" Like, who do I think I am, kind of attitude. So it says good things about her. Anyway, they did get married. The wedding took place in 1221. She was 14 years old. Some of us think that's pretty early to get married, but it was not uncommon in those days. He was 21. They are now the Lord and Lady of Wartburg Castle, and they had a couple of kids pretty early. The next year, Herman was born, 1222. Next year, Sophia was born, 1223. Ludwig was required, because he was a knight under the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor, to be gone from time to time, maybe for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, for training and for other knightly duties, and so he would be gone. And one very interesting little story about Elizabeth is when Ludwig was gone, she would dress down. I don't know what dress down means exactly, but it was like the ordinary clothing that wouldn't distinguish a person as royalty. And she would go down and hang out in the town. And she liked to do that, and she liked to bring little gifts, whatever she could, just as it was possible. There were limits to what she could do, but at least she wanted to be there. And she did have this rather interesting interest in these people. But when Ludwig returned, then she would dress up, because she wanted to be as attractive as she could to her husband, you know. And that story is told by more than one source, indicating there's probably some truth to it. So she wanted her husband to see her at her best, but the rest of the time she was willing to go down and kind of be just one of the people there. It's just an interesting thing about her. In 1223, Franciscans arrived. Remember, the Franciscan order got started 1207, so we're only 20 years or so into the story. They arrive here. They all are kind of distributed around the whole region, and so some arrive here and begin to provide what they can to help the poor in that community. She has a lot in common with them. She likes the Franciscans, kind of like her soulmates. She liked what she saw them doing. She tried to support them as much as she could, so she had kind of others now who were sharing a little bit of her interest in those matters. She's about 17 or 18 years of age. There was another fellow that showed up at this point who was called a secular priest. His name is Conrad. He gets mixed reviews. I think on balance he was a positive influence. He was a much older guy. He's called a secular priest because he had no parish. He traveled around kind of like a Franciscan, but he wasn't one. But he was also very concerned about the poor. He also lived a very harsh ascetic life, a life of severe self-deprivation, and he thought everybody else should live the same way, you know. And so whether that was good or not, I don't know. He gets mixed reviews, but Elizabeth liked him, and she was very impressed with him. And some people think she probably was more severe with herself, following his example, than she should have been. But then she's only a teenager, and he's like this, you know, guy with such gravitas that I think we can understand why that would happen. Anyway, he has a pretty important role to play as we go along. In 1224, 4 years before the official date, Pope Leo III, Pope Leo Innocent III, calls for the Sixth Crusade. We're about halfway through all of those. So there have been several. Remember, the first one with Hildegard, when she was born, was the crusade that retook Jerusalem. You know. So it was considered generally a success. The Second Crusade was intended to build on those gains, but it was a flat failure. But it did have a life-changing effect on Bernard of Clairvaux. He was a cheerleader for that crusade, but the crusade itself was a bust. The Third Crusade was triggered by the fact that an Islamic military character named Saladin had retaken Jerusalem, you know. And so now Jerusalem was under the control of the Islamic forces once again. So the Third Crusade was intended to go and recover Jerusalem. That was the most famous crusade. Peter the Lionheart of England and other famous characters. This is kind of where we get the sort of image of the crusade, you know. And they fought battles around Jerusalem, and it finally ended in a draw. And everybody agreed, okay, we'll just divide it up. And so it's kind of a joint control of Jerusalem from that point on, and everybody goes home, and that's kind of where it was left. The Fourth Crusade was ridiculous. They sacked Constantinople, which is a Christian city. Here's the Christian crusaders come and sack a Christian city. What's up with that? I don't know. The Fifth Crusade wound up spinning its wheels in Egypt. So this is now the Sixth Crusade, another shot. These things were pretty, you know, mixed reviews, I'll say that. So this was the desire to go back and try once again to recover Jerusalem, and that was the idea. So he calls for this in 1224. Ludwig, as a knight, is expected to go on this crusade. So in 1226, he goes for training and planning and so on of that crusade. He's in Italy, leaving Elizabeth home. It's their longest separation to date. He's gone there for some months. And it's during this time that we have some very interesting reversals that take place. She is spending most of her time in town. She's caring for the poor, especially poor children, trying to give them food, trying to give them whatever she can, clothing and so on, to meet their immediate and quite evident needs. The Franciscans are helping along with that. When there were problems with food supply, she would actually open the granary of the castle and provide in that means, and that gets her in a lot of trouble. She supplied clothing. She opened another clinic. One was now in Wartburg, one was in Eisenach, and she's just doing this on her own, but she's getting support from the Franciscans. She's would sometimes sell her clothing, and with the money she'd buy, food and basic stuff for these people who were in such need. And she also becomes aware, she's getting old enough now to realize that some of the poverty that's being experienced there was not necessary. It was exploitive taxing that was taking place by virtue of taxing authorities that were really connected to the administration of which she was technically a part. So she's becoming a little bit more savvy about what's really happening here. And that sets up some of the things that happened here. Ludwig came home, fall of 1226. The crusade would be launched in 1227. One eyewitness reported the welcome in these words: "She welcomed her beloved with 1,000 kisses pressed on him with her heart and her lips." She liked her husband, and he liked her, and they were happy to be reunited at that moment. But these local officials who were technically serving under Ludwig complained bitterly to him about this miserable wife of his, who was continuing to give them grief because of their policies of taxation and so on. And so he got an earful from these who were really working under his administration. And to his credit, he said, back off. He backed his wife, and he said they needed to mend their ways. So he did not follow their pressure there whatsoever. And so he was there for some period of time before he had to leave to take part in the next crusade. He left on June 24th. She was carrying their third child by now. She went with him part of the distance to the border where he'd go over the Alps and back into Italy. And as they parted, he prayed a public prayer over her with all of those that were coming with him. And the prayer was as follows, quote, "May Almighty God," this is Ludwig now, "May Almighty God bless you, my dearest sister, and blessed be the fruit of your womb that you bear. Faithfully arrange about it as we have promised each other." So he's making sure she's going to do what they have agreed together will happen with this third child. Ludwig died. Before he ever got on the crusade, the plague touched him. There were thousands of the Sixth Crusade who died of the plague. This is really when one of those kind of sweeping infections came through. And so he was caring for the Holy Roman Emperor himself, who had the plague, and Ludwig contracted it. And so that was that. Well, he died on September 11th. He was 27 years old. On September 29th, 2 weeks later, she gave birth to the third child, Gertrude. She learned about his death the following month, which was in October. Conrad, I don't know if this is good or not, I'll leave it to your own assessment, but Conrad strongly encouraged Elizabeth to take a vow of celibacy at this point. Now, it doesn't mean she became a nun, but it does mean that she would then, of course, not marry again. And so, and I don't know, use your own judgment, but that was kind of the way he was. He had such an impact on her, such an influence on her. She did it. So she took a vow of celibacy at that point. And for whatever reasons, that was probably viewed as a noble thing to do, Anyway, the nobility, now that Ludwig is dead, they turn on her in a heartbeat. Because now she's lost. Her claim to fame in that region was her husband. She doesn't have an independent status except connected to him, and he's gone. And so at that point, it's like a made-for-movies situation. She is They seize her dowry, which has been intact all this time. They force her to flee. They actually chase her out of the castle. In fact, she has to flee for her life with her children. She's a fugitive. She winds up at an innkeeper's place. He doesn't know what to put. He puts her in a shed for the pigs, and she's there. And in the middle of the night, she sneaks off to the Franciscans, hoping maybe they'll take her in. They don't want her because they're afraid of these nobility guys. You know, they're coming and they got weapons and so on. So finally she rushes to a church and goes into the church seeking sanctuary there with her 3 kids, and that's where she's apprehended. These nobility, they know better than to just execute her. That would be over the top, but they do now have control of her. They hand her over to a wealthy family who's kind of, you know, sympathetic with the interests of these princes and so on. She's put into this home in a kind of house arrest. It's a very small space in a very large house. So it's a tough situation, and that's where she is. Her children were sent back to Wartburg. She couldn't even care for them at this point, as you can imagine. She can barely care for herself. The children are the children of Ludwig, so they're going to be treated well. And they all go back to Wartburg Castle, so she knows they'll be safe there. And she herself, at that point, is handed off to her uncle. She's not in good health at this point. This has been a few days or a couple of weeks of pretty severe treatment. She has a maternal uncle who lives in a different area. His name is Eckbert. You would think an uncle would be really sympathetic to her, but he's kind of a politician, and so he's trying to play the game. But he takes her in and puts her in a little castle under house arrest. The place is called Pottenstein, and you can visit it if you'd like to. It's a wonderful place, but not exactly a vacation paradise. And so that's where she is, and she's there for some period of time in that castle. The uncle is just lobbying her heavily, get remarried. Marry some dude, live happily ever after, call it a day. You know, that's the best way out of this jam. And she says, I took a vow of celibacy. And, you know, I can't do that. And he didn't understand that. He didn't have much Christian faith or appreciation of that. He thought, these are extraordinary circumstances. You know, do what you got to do. So she refused. So she was there for some period of time in that castle, just kind of, you know, I don't know, she's probably online just looking at stuff. But anyway, eventually she was released because Ludwig's body had been buried in Italy, but now was being transported back to Thuringia for a proper funeral and a proper burial. And under those circumstances, she was given safe passage to come back with his body to Thuringia, and that was in 1228. And so she arrives, and it was a very interesting scene. Again, I'd like to see this in the movies, because you've got the nobility, which are grousing about this, you know, and the poor who are treating her like a rock star. She has been so popular with them, and they haven't seen her for a long time, and here she is coming back with safe passage and, you know, decent kind of traveling, and they just erupt in cheering for her. And all through the town, you just have all of these people. And so it really was quite embarrassing to these poor nobles who've been treating her just like a criminal, and yet obviously she's won all of this wonderful, you know, kind of praise from the popular masses. They sort of cave in and say, okay, Elizabeth, you can move back to the castle. You know, you're going to be the widow, you're going to be fine, and it's okay. They were like embarrassed. She said, no way, no, I'm not moving back to that castle. So she refused, and she actually moved into the community, kind of living with the poor there in the town of Wartburg. At the funeral, she knelt beside the casket of her husband Ludwig and prayed the following prayer publicly. Lord, I give you thanks for having mercifully consoled me by these bones of my husband, which I have so much desired. Great as my love for him was, You know that I do not begrudge the sacrifice that my beloved and I made of himself to you for the liberation of the Holy Land, the crusade, you know. If I could have him, I would give the whole world for him and go begging with him forever. But I call upon you to witness that I would not want to redeem his life, even if it cost me but a single hair, if it were against your will. Now I recommend myself and him to your grace. May your will for us be done. And so that prayer from Elizabeth really tells us a lot about her. Well, she's living there in poverty circumstances in the town. She still doesn't have any resources to speak of, but the good graces of the people that she's cared for are providing for her as they can. But some of the Franciscans says, enough of this nonsense, and they made the trip to Rome and grabbed the Pope by the collar and said, look, bud, you need to step in, you know, and they told him about Elizabeth and all of her history. And so he intervened, and he prevailed, put incredible pressure on these brothers to restore to her her dowry. She had a fair amount of money sitting in the bank there, you know, that was still there. And so the brothers gave in under papal pressure and restored her dowry. So now at this point, she's not fabulously wealthy, but at least she has the means to sustain herself and so on. And so she's still living there in the community, but she has not only the means to care for herself, but now to actually have some practical means of providing service to those that she's cared about for so long. So she does that. In 1228, she takes up residence in Wartburg, living a simple life, providing for herself. Her children are returned to her. The famous image of her is spinning cloth. She did that, a lot of it. She spent hours doing this kind of work. Her last years, however, probably the signature item was she did build what amounts to a kind of very primitive early hospital kind of thing. It was opened in 1229. It was intended for people who are in various disease situations, whether it was hunger or disease or whatever it might be. And it was not run by cloistered people, not nuns. But in the Catholic tradition at this point, a kind of order of female ministers was started called the Third Order. And these were people who were not nuns, but they did take a vow of celibacy, and they did work largely in these hospitals. We would say they were kind of the very early version of Florence Nightingale or something like that. So they were there caring for them. They were independent healthcare facilities, the very early version of what you'd consider to be a hospital. It's very interesting that through church history, of course, there's been hundreds and thousands of hospitals that have been built. Vastly, the majority of them have been built by Christian ministries, including right here in Spokane, as you're well aware, you know, Sacred Heart, Holy Family. I mean, we take it for granted, but in fact, it was Christian ministries that started these. And in church history, probably well in the range of 99% of hospitals traced back to Elizabeth have been built as expressions of a Christian conscience and caring for people. And that's what she did. So it was a simple kind of rudimentary thing, but care was provided, food was provided, healthcare provisions made for them. Elizabeth continued that. She lived in simple clothing, devoted to the poor for the rest of her life. Some have called her a female version of St. Francis. She was well known not only for her practical service, but she seems always to have had a very legitimate and sincere, authentic, devotional life as well. Many, many other women. This became quite a movement. So she was triggering something that really spread across much of Europe at that point over the next several decades following that example. Her last days, she fell ill in 1231. Some think it was from maybe contracting disease processes herself, working there, or from other kinds of privations. It's not clear. But it certainly is clear that she spent her final days absorbed in prayer. On her death, she said, before her death, that what was left of her dowry, and there was still quite a bit, should be immediately liquidated and given for the ongoing service to the poor in that community. And she died on November 17th, 1231, at 21 years old, or 24 years old. Very young, you know, and to have left such an impact at such a young age is rather remarkable. Her grave became a well-known place of pilgrimage. It's there to this day. If you ever happen to be in the region of Thuringia, you can drop by and see it there. Conrad, who I've mentioned before, on her death, went straight to the Pope and basically banged on his door, demanding that she be sainted, you know, which is pretty unusual, not only because of her youth, but because usually it takes a lot longer to have that. But he was kind of an advocate for her, and in fact, in 1235, she was sainted, so you'll hear her called Saint Elizabeth, and the church in her name is there in that region, which you can also visit. So, remarkable story, one of those that you know, many people know the name but may not know much of what was the backstory for her, but she's really quite an inspirational character. Sunday school lesson, boy, I'm so early. I'm tempted to preach for a while. No, I'm just going to do this quickly, and you will get you out of here sooner than usual. But this applies to Elizabeth and to all of us. The Apostle Paul says to you to assess your gifts. I am speaking to a group of people here who I happen to know are leaders in this church. And so I realize that in some ways to say this to you is to, you know, remark the obvious. But it's a good reminder for all of us. Assess your gifts. Paul says, through the grace given to me, to everyone among you, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but think soberly. He doesn't say think more lowly of yourself either, you know. This isn't a call to just have a rotten self-image. Think soberly, and what that means is you look in the mirror and you say, what can I do? What are my gifts? We have different gifts, you know. And all those gifts work together. And so to have a sober grasp, this is what God has given me the capacity and interest and competence to do. That's the call. Think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Elizabeth had gifts. She had remarkable interest in the plight of the poor, and she was motivated and she did something about it based on what she had, and it is a great example for all of us. We have many members in one body, but the members don't all have the same function. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, individually members of another. Number two, before you do anything with your gift, give it to God. You know, gifts can be used for good purposes or not good purposes. Remember that part about selfish ambition. The first thing you do with your gift is you say it's yours. You gave it to me, God. I didn't invent this thing. You gave it to me. It's a gift from you. And so I first of all give it back to you and surrender it for your purposes rather than my personal interests. Because I'm going to tell you a secret, some gifts, depending on the gift, can actually make you a lot of money. You know, nothing wrong with making money. But the first thing we want to do with any gift we have is say, this is yours. You are the one who needs to direct me along the way. Paul says earlier in the same chapter, I beseech you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies. The body is the vehicle by which we exercise the gifts that God has entrusted to us. The body is the means by doing that. And so you give it first to God. And then you're in a position to do number three, use it for others. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, you know. Here's God among us, the creator of the galaxies. God who is almighty in the size of a normal human being, washing the feet of his disciples. The more I think about that, the more stunning the image is. But that's the picture. And that's what we're called to do. And you know, whatever you're called to do, whether it's up front or in the back room or wherever, we're washing each other's feet. That's the right attitude. That's what we're called to. Having then gifts differing according to the grace given to us, let's use them. So let's go use them, you know. And whether it's in the way that Elizabeth did or somebody else, that'll be up to God's work in your life. But with that, friends, I am done.